Thank you for coming today. I'm really excited to be here. And maybe before we get in, I'll just give you a little background on Electrify Now and how this all started. I retired from another sneaker company about 4 years ago, and I was working there on corporate sustainability. And when I retired, I'd always been kind of interested in, well, really obsessed, actually is a better word, with what individuals can do to help fight climate change. And so when someday you will experience this, when you retire, you have a lot of time. And so I had time to research and just poke into things and learn a lot of things that I didn't learn on the job, actually, about sustainability and specifically around energy. And it led to being extremely frustrated that there wasn't really good sources of information available to regular people about the really impactful things we can do and about our role in changing the systems that are really at the heart of the climate change problem, our energy systems. And at the time, who remembers the whole plastic straws thing, where it seemed like the only thing anyone wanted to talk about in sustainability was straws. And that's what was happening 4 years ago. And so in the face of that, it felt like while that's, waste is obviously a really important issue and recycling are really important issues, it felt like they were masking the real conversation that should be happening, which was about energy. And so you're going to see that most of what we talk about today is about energy. And the reason of that is pretty simple, because I have to admit that even though I was a corporate sustainability officer, I couldn't really have answered this question very adequately 4 years ago until I really started to dive into it. And you have to do some math, because the way that this information is presented is usually not very helpful. So what I've done is I've taken information from the EPA and I've repackaged it a little bit to make it simpler. And what you find out is a quarter of the emissions in this country come from generating electricity. A little bit over another quarter come from transportation, and we're going to dive into these things a little bit more later. And then another quarter or more actually is from burning fossil fuels for heat. And then, of course, there's agriculture. There's a lot of airplay around this too. And again, there are agriculture issues for sure. But it's important to realize that they pale in comparison to these other ones that are about energy. And even in that agriculture number of 11% here in the United States, a huge portion of that is fertilizer, and there's energy related to that too. And then there's these other mysterious industrial processes, but those are, largely speaking, cement and municipal waste, treatment plants, things like that. So 82% of the problem, so to speak, is from burning fossil fuels for these three types of energy that it's hard to imagine us doing without, right? I mean, we're going to need electricity, we need transportation, we need heat. And in actual fact, people all over the world need these things, and there are some countries where they don't have, they don't have proper access to those, what we consider to be like essentials. If you look at other countries around the world, you'll see a very similar picture. It'll change slightly from country to country. If you looked at Europe, it would be almost identical. Country like maybe a country in Africa or South America, the agriculture number would be higher, but it's still going to be in that 70 to 80% from energy. So, all right, let's think about it at the household level. At the household level, about 60% of the emissions that we're responsible for as individuals comes from the energy that we purchase. So think of it as your electric bill, your natural gas bill if you have that, or gasoline to fill your cars. And then, there's carbon emissions associated with the products that we buy and the food that we eat. But I think all of us would probably attest to the fact that it's hard to do a lot over here. You can buy responsibly. You can buy from companies like Adidas that are really sweating the details on lowering carbon emissions on stuff. You can buy food that's grown locally and organically and regeneratively. And maybe you shave these percentages a little bit. You make these boxes slightly smaller. But this big 60% box here, it's entirely possible to take that to zero. Completely eliminate 60% of your personal emissions. And we've done it in our home. I know a lot of people here have done, Eli and Noel, who I'll introduce you to later, have done it in their homes too, and we've helped hundreds of people around the state of Oregon to do these things. It's entirely possible to do. And so that's kind of why it's so important to be thinking about energy, because the root of the problem is that we have been burning coal and natural gas to produce electricity primarily. There's obviously more renewables coming on all the time now, which is good. We've been using gasoline and diesel for transportation, and natural gas, and to some degree propane and heating oil, but it's really natural gas is the problem on the heat side. And this is one where I like to spend a little extra attention because there's so much greenwashing around natural gas. I mean, you hear this all the time, the clean blue flame, and Northwest Natural talks a big game about getting to zero, which is technically not possible and highly unlikely to happen and extremely expensive to do. And we learn all the time that methane, although it has its reputation as a bridge fuel, it's not a lot better than coal in terms of its total impact. It's a major source of air pollution. It's invisible. You don't really see it, but burning natural gas is becoming one of the most important sources of air pollution in our city and other cities around the country. And then you'll hear this story about renewable natural gas, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it suffices to say, while yes, there may be a role for renewable natural gas in our future energy systems, the idea that we can just like keep burning gas in our homes and it's going to be all clean is just completely poop, as Nancy Pelosi would say. Okay, so the bad news is that we have to stop burning fossil fuels. And I think it's important to think about this, to absorb that context, like stop burning fossil fuels. I mean, I think for a lot of us in the environmental movement have grown up with this idea of less of everything. And that's a good thing, but at this point, less isn't enough. It's about eliminating fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels altogether. And that's what we're going to talk about in the context of our own homes in particular. The good news, though, after all that bad news, is that wind and solar are now the lowest cost ways to generate new energy. And it's even starting to be the case that wind and solar competes with existing, new wind and solar competes with existing things like existing gas plants, et cetera. So you can see the white lines here, wind and solar have just plummeted in cost over the last 20 years. And they're projected to go even further. I mean, right now we're hitting a little speed bump where we're seeing some price increases because of supply chain stuff, which it'll take a while to get sorted out. But the future, all the experts say that these two technologies are continue to go lower and lower in price because as we build more of them, it's a technological problem that as you build more of these things, the price gets lower. That's not true with things like fossil fuels or commodity products where there's really there's not tremendous economies of scale that you get from doing more of it. The costs for natural gas have been extremely flat over the last 30 years, and even as new technologies like fracking have come along. So the point is, renewables are going to get cheaper while fossil fuels are most likely going to get more expensive as carbon taxes and things like that start to get applied. So that's great. Battery storage costs, same thing's happening. The costs are plummeting and will continue to go further. And then the other thing that a lot of people don't see because it's been so incremental is that electric appliances have become unbelievably more energy efficient in our lifetime. And the light bulb is kind of like a poster child for this. The LED light bulb, 10 times more energy efficient than the incandescent bulb, the LED to the incandescent. But that's true of everything. Our refrigerators, our computers, our stereos, anything that you plug into the wall is using much less energy now than it did even a decade ago. And so what you see is that as a result of more renewables coming online, that our electricity supply is getting cleaner. This is what's been happening over the last 20 years. And this curve is starting to get really much steeper because there's incentives now. The technology is cheaper. Like if you look at the data, basically almost all the new energy generation that's scheduled for the next 5 years is renewables. It's primarily renewables. So this line is going to continue to go down. So you add all these things up. Cheap renewables, electric devices that are extremely efficient, a grid that's getting cleaner literally every minute, not just every year. And it's impossible to kind of escape this idea that we should be electrifying everything. And you hear this terminology more and more. Sometimes you hear beneficial electrification. I'm like, you're picking nits. It's about electrifying everything. And it's conjuring up this image of a future where we get all of the energy that we need from the wind and the sun, and it powers all of those three primary energy needs that we talked about: electricity, transportation, and heat. And the truth is that the technology is available today to do this today. And so that's why this electrification movement has started to really pick up speed. And there's these almost like too good to be true side benefits that come along with doing this. First of all, our energy costs go down. Second, we get clean air. Think about this for a minute. Like, where does pollution come from? It comes primarily from burning stuff and primarily from burning fossil fuels. We get cleaner water and more available fresh water. I've heard estimates that vary anywhere from 10% to as high as 30% of available fresh water that's used for fossil fuels production in various places around the world. So much more clean water and a stronger economy. All the studies show that this transition, while it's going to be expensive, it also creates tons of jobs, and it lowers costs in other ways that pay for itself over time. Tremendous savings in health costs and other things that are kind of, again, almost like side benefits in our battle to stop climate change. So that's all the good news, but then, back to the bad news. I don't know if this is bad news. This is just like a reality, is that if you think about, again, this context of zero fossil fuels, that before 2050, which is the kind of artificial time we picked where we got to get our crap together, every single device that burns fossil fuels today needs to be replaced with a clean alternative. And this is where it gets a little bit, like, it can feel daunting. Thousands of coal plants and gas plants need to be retired and converted to renewable energy. Millions and millions, hundreds of millions of cars and trucks need to be converted from fossil fuels to clean electric. Millions of gas furnaces and boilers and all those things, that some of which we have in our homes, but every building most likely has something in it that's burning fossil fuels. Those need to be replaced. So that can feel overpowering. Rewiring America, our friends there talk about 1 billion machines that need to be, replaced. But on the other hand, we have 30 years to do this, and in those 30 years, the sooner the better, but in 30 years, all those devices that we just listed are going to see the end of their useful life, most likely. So the point is, we should be switching them over as quickly as we can, but for sure, when anything has its end-of-life event, we need to make sure we're replacing it with something better. And that's part of the reason why we're talking today, because I have no idea in your lives, your ability or interest or where you are on this whole thing about replacing stuff. But the first step is to know what the options are, the good options are, when the time comes to replace something. So, and again, back to the good news here, we have all the solutions we need. We have wind and solar that's super available. We'll talk about how you get that. We have electric vehicles that are actually way more cost-effective and accessible and affordable than a lot of people think. We'll talk about that. There's heat pumps, which are these kind of almost like magic technology for heating our buildings and our water. They're available today. These are not things that we need research to figure out. They're solutions that are here, and the issue that we have is really a scaling issue, which is, again, why it's so important that all of us understand what the options are, because we can be part of the scaling solution. Okay, so just to give you an idea about why this is so powerful, when we combine renewable energy and electrification, it's not just reducing emissions a little bit, you're eliminating emissions whenever you combine those two things. And the easiest way to see this is in our own homes. So here in Oregon, a typical home will produce something like, or be responsible for, maybe there's a better way to say it, 3 to 5 tons of carbon emissions from the electricity that we consume to power a typical home. 3 to 5 tons. It can be more than that, or less than that if you have a small home, et cetera. But that's a good range, 3 to 5. And one car, 4 to 8, again, depending on how much you drive it and what mileage you get, but you get my idea. A gas furnace, pretty similar to a car, 4 to 8 tons, and a gas water heater, 1 to 3 tons. So these are the 4 typically largest sources of emissions that any one person has in their life. And if you're really diligent, so put your old school conservation hat on, and you're turning the lights off, and you're wearing the sweater, and you're driving slower and less often, and you're taking cold showers. You could reduce these numbers by 20% if you're really diligent and you do these things every day. But compare that to what happens when you combine renewable energy and electrification. First of all, we're going to get our renewable energy from community solar, which we'll talk more about it, but you can do that right today if you're interested. But you can get your energy, your electricity from renewable sources. You can do it today. 0 tons for your electricity. An EV charged with that renewable electricity will create 0 tons per year. Your heat pump, again, running on that clean electricity, will produce 0 emissions to heat your home and 0 emissions to heat your water. So we haven't just reduced them tiny, we've eliminated them completely from our homes by taking these actions, which we'll go into in a little bit more detail. And the result of that is the typical home that would be normally creating 20 to 30 tons of CO2 from the energy emissions part that we talked about can go to 0. And the other amazing thing about this is that a typical home here in Oregon is going to cost us about $4,000 a year for those energy bills we talked about, electricity, gas, and gasoline. It can be higher than that because gasoline has gone up quite a bit. 2-car family, it might be closer to $5,000. And you could be spending $3,000 instead. And the other thing is, think about where this money is going. When you spend $4,000 a year, where does that money go? It goes to buying fossil fuels, the vast majority of it. And when you spend this, in this scenario, this $3,000, you're spending it on the solutions, renewable energy, clean transportation, heat pumps. You're investing that money that you have to spend on the solution rather than on the problem. So that's why this is so impactful, this combination of renewable energy and electrification. And along the way, you're going to live in a home that's safer and more comfortable. We'll talk about why that is. We talked about this, spending your money on the solution rather than the problem. And the other thing that I think is really important to kind of think about a little bit is that it's really easy to think about your carbon footprint and go, oh, this is my carbon footprint. How can I make it go to 0? It's a good way of thinking. But it's equally as powerful to say, how can I be a positive force for change and help to scale these solutions that we know are the important things? And one of the ways to do that is to, if you decide buying an EV is right for you, talk to your friends and family about how great it is. If you decide that a heat pump water heater really makes sense in your home, tell all your friends about it, because what you're doing is you're helping to propagate these solutions and scale these solutions through your own personal influence. So we try to keep it really simple for people at Electrify Now about, okay, how do you do these things? How do you do this? And so that's why we break it down to these 4 things: getting clean energy in your home, electrifying your transportation, and then we're not going to talk about it as much today just for time, but it's important to recognize that there are a lot of people in our communities even who will have struggled to go through this transition with us, people, low-income people in particular, BIPOC communities, people on the front lines. We have to find ways to help them through philanthropy and policy. So for me, this is more just it's important that we're all aware of that. So when you hear legislation come along that's prioritizing heat pumps for low-income community, it's there's a reason for that. It's because we need to help these folks, and because some of us can do these things on our own.